I'm not sure why I spoke those words, but they slipped out before I could hold them back. I was simply chatting with my sibling, Lila, lightly mentioning that if I could start over, I wouldn't have chosen my partner, Ethan. At that moment, it seemed like no big deal, just a careless remark you toss out when you're feeling irritated. But the second I glimpsed Ethan's face, I understood how horribly I blundered. He'd been lingering there, out of view, and he'd caught every word. He didn't shout, didn't demand answers, didn't even appear upset. He just gazed at me for a heartbeat, his face blank, then turned and left. The sound of the front door shutting rang louder than I'd expected, and right then I knew I'd voiced something I couldn't undo. For a short while, I persuaded myself it wasn't serious. Pairs argue. Folks blurt out things they don't mean. It's normal, isn't it? But as the hours crawled by and Ethan didn't return, my easy shrug turned into worry. I messaged him once, then twice, asking if he was fine, but no reply came. That heavy feeling began to swell. What if this wasn't just about my words? What if I'd struck a sore spot I hadn't even noticed was there? It wasn't only about him stepping out for a bit. It was the dread that perhaps, just perhaps, I'd sown a tiny doubt in his thoughts, one that might unravel all we'd created together. What if this time he stayed away for good? I tried to dismiss it at first, telling myself Ethan was just overreacting. I even chuckled about it with Lila, saying he'd return once he'd calmed down. But as the night stretched on, and the house remained strangely silent, my irritation began to blend with fear. I kept repeating to myself that he was okay, that he'd stroll back through the door soon. But deep inside, I couldn't shake the tight twist in my belly. I sent him another message, something simple like, "Are you all right?" But as the quiet stretched into hours, my annoyance swelled. How could Ethan dismiss me over something so tiny? By the time I finally climbed into bed, I was restless, my thoughts jumping between irritation and unease. I despised how helpless it made me feel, as if the grip I believed I had on our bond was sliding through my hands. The next morning, his side of the bed remained empty, and that jittery sensation I'd pushed down the night before crashed over me like a tide. His toothbrush sat untouched in the bathroom. His shoes stayed by the entrance. It was as though he'd simply disappeared. I messaged him again, this time less relaxed. "Can we chat?" Still, no answer came. The stillness grew intolerable, and my frustration started to boil. Was this his way of scolding me, of making me feel ashamed? I convinced myself I wasn't to blame. If Ethan had an issue, he could have stayed and discussed it, like a grown-up. Yet, even as I tried to defend my words, the lump in my chest tightened. I loathed being overlooked, hated how this hush made me doubt everything. For the first time, I began to ponder, had I crossed the line this time? Was he truly finished with me? That idea scared me, but I wasn't prepared to own up to it just yet. By the time the second evening arrived, the quiet in the house felt overwhelming. I was perched in the kitchen when I heard the front door creak open. Relief flooded through me, but it didn't last long. Ethan stepped in, steady as always, but something about him felt different, something firm. He didn't shout or fling blame. Instead, he just said, "We need to speak." His voice was calm, almost chilly, and it threw me off balance. I tried to act breezy, tossing out a snarky remark, but his coolness rattled me. When he began talking, I realized this wouldn't be an ordinary disagreement. Ethan spoke to me with painful truthfulness, explaining how my remarks had wounded him, not only what I'd voiced that evening, but how I'd acted toward him over the years. Each sentence was like a glass, showing my own shortcomings back to me. I longed to protest, to shield myself, but inside, I understood he was correct. Then he uttered the phrase I wasn't ready for. "Perhaps I shouldn't stay here any longer." My chest tightened as I saw him grab his bag and depart once more, this time with a stillness that seemed lasting. I stood there, shocked, as the burden of my choices finally struck me. The days after blurred together. The home, once warmed by his company, now felt empty and stiflingly silent. I kept hoping for a text, a ring, anything, but Ethan had gone completely quiet. I tried to busy myself with tasks and pals, but nothing could mend the widening gap. Weeks later, when I spotted him again, he wasn't the same. He appeared stronger, fitter, more assured, as if a load had lifted from him. And he wasn't. Solo. Across from him at the cafe sat a lady who looked perfectly comfortable, and the way he chuckled with her. It was a version of him I hadn't glimpsed in ages. For a second, I wanted to rush over to remind him I was still his partner, but I couldn't. All I could do was linger there, watching the man I'd undervalued move forward without me. That's when the full force of my deeds sank in. This wasn't just about one thoughtless comment. It was about years of treating him like he didn't matter, like I couldn't see what I'd had. Now, Ethan had chosen himself instead of patching something that had been shattered for much too long. As much as it stung, I knew he was justified. For the first time, I wasn't merely alone. I felt the heaviness of my own errors, and I realized that if I ever hoped to recover, I had to confront the reality. The issue wasn't Ethan. It was me.